welcome to Sunday Showers from the Source. I'm Patrice Hunt, and thank you for joining me this Sunday. I have a question for you. Have you ever been in a situation or a circumstance that was just perfect? You felt like everything was going great. It was just the best thing. You were flourishing and prospering, and everything was great. You were doing what you were supposed to do. Other people involved in the situation were doing what they were supposed to do. You felt that everything was like just copacetic. Everything was just meshing together. It was perfect. It was wonderful. You were flourishing. This was like the best situation you had ever been in your life until it wasn't. Whether that is, maybe that was a job and you worked hard, you got along with your coworkers, everybody pulled their own weight, everything worked the way it was supposed to, just perfectly. You enjoyed it, they valued you, you enjoyed your time there, all of that. And then your boss changed, or your favorite coworker left, or new management came in and they just kind of revamped the whole way the office was run or something like that. Or maybe it was a relationship where you were so in love with this person and they just did everything perfectly. They were handsome or beautiful. They catered to your needs. They were vulnerable when they needed to be and strong when you needed them to be. They were just everything you needed them to be until maybe they cheated, or maybe they started to be distant. Maybe they realized that they weren't ready for more of a serious relationship and they needed time away. And then it wasn't as good as it was before. Or maybe you were a part of this organization where everybody was of like mind, and everybody knew the goal, knew the purpose that you were trying to accomplish, and everybody was just ready and in tune and perfect with each other. And then maybe somebody else came in and kind of changed the dynamic of the group. Or maybe once y'all reached that goal, it was kind of like y'all were floundering. Or maybe just some kind of obstacle came in and changed how people saw each other and talked to each other and valued each other. And so it just changed all of that, the whole situation and the whole dynamic. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And this is our third week in the 105 number of Psalms. And so where we are today is we're in verses 24 and 25. And verses 24 and 25 kind of talk about this same thing happening. So verse 24 says, "The Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them too numerous for their foes." Verse 25 says, "Whose hearts he turned to hate his people, to conspire against his servants." Now, last week we talked about Joseph going to Egypt, and how God had used Joseph as a provision because he knew the famine was coming, and that he was going to put Joseph in place so that he could bless Egypt, yes, but more importantly, his people, Jacob's family, and which are the descendants of Abraham, and how God had sent Joseph to Egypt 21 years before the famine even happened, and then 23 years before it affected Jacob and his family enough for him to send his sons to Egypt to ask, to buy food. So we talked about that, and we talked about how that was the provision. Well, what happened after that was that Joseph eventually revealed who he was, because his brothers didn't remember who he was. He revealed who he was to his brothers, and he asked them to bring everybody up. And once they did, he welcomed them into his home, and Pharaoh welcomed them into Egypt. And basically, Jacob's family relocated to where they had previously been living, to Egypt. Well, to right outside of Egypt. Pharaoh gave them land where they could have their livestock graze and all of that, and flourish and build their tents and live in that land and flourish. It was about 70 of them that came up and made that trek. And so they were being taken care of during the famine, because Joseph was over, all things famine, and he was second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt. And so there was really nothing that they lacked or that they needed. And under this ideal situation where there is nothing that they lack, there's nothing that that they need, they flourished. They multiplied, they grew in numbers and all of that. And eventually, well, Jacob died, and then eventually Joseph and his brothers and that generation died. And so you have a new generation of the descendants of Jacob that probably never really knew the famine. They didn't know anything but living in Egypt, you know? And so I think that the thing that really stood out to me in this was that once this new generation, like once these new generations started coming up and they really didn't know anything about the famine, all they knew was living in Egypt and flourishing and thriving, and they didn't really know lack. And so, um, it just opens my eyes that like sometimes the further we get away from the famine, the easier it is to forget the details of it. So when like Joseph and Jacob and like all Joseph's brothers and probably their children understood the idea of the famine. They understood that there was a time when their family and that people everywhere in the land didn't have enough food to survive. And when they had to do this whole relocation, they remember this. But can you imagine? Like now, we know intellectually that there was a time where there was no indoor plumbing. I'm going to even take it back easier. My son asked me the other day, "So mom, what how was restrooms in the 90s?" I was like, "What?" You know, like what did restrooms look like in the 90s? Son, the 90s was just 3 years ago. What you talking about? That's how I felt. And I'm like, how dare you say, like, what were the restrooms like in the 90s? But his generation, like, he thinks things were just completely different. And then another thing is like when DVDs came out, we thought that was this amazing thing. And so like my daughter remembers having to have a little case of her DVDs that we took in the car with us, and she would play it on her little portable DVD player on long trips. But all my son knows, because he's younger, all he knows is Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, YouTube. That's all he knows. He knows instantaneously. I go on YouTube and I find my favorite person and video to watch and I watch it. Or I go on Disney Plus and I find this movie and I watch it. He doesn't know about like finding the DVD and then making sure you keep it clean and making sure it doesn't get scratched. Because if it gets scratched, you can't use it in the DVD player and all this other kind of stuff. He cannot fathom that lifestyle. And so it's the same way with, on a different level, on a much more serious level, but it's kind of similar with the children of Israel when the descendants of the generation died out that experienced the famine, and then you get these generations that only experienced abundance and no lack, then of course they're going to be like, oh, what you mean? Like they're not going to understand it. So it's easier for them to forget the details of the famine and all that God had done and how he had made a way for their family during the famine. But it wasn't just the Israelites who forgot the details of the famine as generations died out. It was the Egyptians as well. And so you get to a time when a king becomes empowered that didn't know Joseph. He didn't remember Joseph. He didn't experience Joseph. He didn't give a flying flea about Joseph. And because of that, he had no respect or reason to treat the Israelites any special way because he didn't know Joseph. And so when he came about, he was intimidated, and he felt like because the Israelites were growing in number and because they were flourishing where they were, he somehow got in his mind that, oh, they're going to rebel against us. They're going to team up with our enemies if we ever go into a war. He came up with this hypothetical war that if they ever got into, that the Israelites would team up with their enemies against them, and that because they were so numerous. So he was like, to nip this in the bud, we're going to enslave them, which is crazy to me because I feel like if you're treating somebody good, they're more likely to stay around and be on your side than they are if you mistreat them. But who knows? We never know what people are thinking. But what happened was, he wanted to enslave them. So they did. They decided to enslave the Israelites and make them build shrines and monuments. And um, then he realized that, oh, hold on, they're still flourishing. They're still multiplying. They're still being more in numbers. So we're going to have to just kill all their sons. And he told the midwives, hey, if when you're giving birth to when these Israelites women are giving birth to their sons, you got to kill them as soon as they come out. And they, the midwives believed in the Lord and so in God, and so they wouldn't do that. And they came up with an excuse not to do it, and on why they couldn't do it. And he said, okay, well, since that's not working, every son that's born, you got to throw him in the Nile, regardless of how old. When the child is born, if you see an Israelite son, throw him in the Nile. And so they were increasingly being treated worse and worse and worse. Whereas before, they were in this great situation. Exodus 1:12 says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And so that was that's how he was feeling. He was like, the more I do to you, it seemed like y'all just don't, it's like y'all won't die like a Twinkie, like you never go bad or whatever. And so I just think that was amazing to me as well. But, of course, every time I read originally in the CEV first, and then I go to the NIV and the KJV just to make sure, like I said last week, that I get every aspect, that I'm not missing anything or missing any understanding. And so the CEV says it this way. They were the Lord's people, so he let them grow stronger than their enemies. They served the Lord, and he made the Egyptians plan hateful things against them. So where the CEV says that he let them grow stronger than their enemies, and the NIV says he made them too numerous for their foes, they were prospering in the land of Egypt. And they were doing so well and so good that they probably got comfortable there. Now I know for a fact that God didn't just leave the promise that he made to Abraham at Abraham. He made that same promise to Jacob, which I'm sure Jacob shared with his family. And I'm sure this was something that was shared throughout the years, through generations. So you knew that you weren't supposed to be staying in Egypt. But sometimes when we get to Egypt and it's comfortable, we like, why are we going to leave? What's the point of leaving? And so God had to make the situation change. And so because he was like, well, hold on, you're getting a little too comfortable in Egypt when I still need you to go to the promise. I have given you a promise in Canaan that I need you to go ahead and take in, and I need you to be willing to go and be a part of and go take. But if you stay in Egypt and get comfortable and grow and multiply, there's nothing that's about you that's going to make you want to leave. So I think that's why it's interesting that in verse 25, he said that he made the Egyptian, in the CEV, it says he made the Egyptians plan hateful things against him. And then in verse 25 of the NIV, it says, whose hearts he turned to hate his people, to conspire against his servants. So it was like God made this stirring in them to see the Israelites in a different way, so that the Israelites could be uncomfortable, so that he could get them out of there type of thing. And I feel like that's the same thing that happens to us sometimes. Sometimes, whether it's a job, whether it's a relationship, whether it's being a part of an organization or a group, sometimes we get so comfortable in somewhere that God didn't necessarily want us to stay in, that he got to give us the push that's needed to get out of there. My grandmother says it this way: you got to go from butt to feet, from feet to moving. So God needed to motivate the Israelites to eventually go from butt to feet, and from feet to moving. So the first week we talked about the promise, and that promise was that God made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would be numerous and that they would dwell in the land of Canaan. And we talked about how God gives us promises, and sometimes it takes a long time for those promises to come to fruition, but we need to be patient and we need to wait on the Lord. And most of all, we need to trust that his promises are real and that he is going to fulfill his promises. The second week, we talked about the provision, and we talked about how Joseph went to Egypt. And Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he ended up in Egypt, and then he ended up in Potiphar's house, and he had favor with Potiphar, and Potiphar's house flourished, and then he ended up in jail, but he still had favor in jail. They put him over the jail, and over the people in jail, and then he also had interpreted dreams while he was in jail, and then he eventually came to Pharaoh's king, to be second in command to Pharaoh. And so we talked about how God will make provisions for us, and it seems like, oh Lord, I asked you for this. And sometimes it seems like instantaneous. Like as soon as you ask for it, God blesses you with it. But it's been things that he's been working on in the background for a long time. I think last week I called it him playing the long game, that he's putting things and people and situations and circumstances in place now so that he can bless you in the future. And so we talked about that and how he always provides for us and how we should look for his provisions in our life and things like that. And so this week we're talking about the push, which is in essence God pushing the Israelites out of their comfort zone, and so that they won't stay stagnant in one place, that in the place that he doesn't want them to stay, which is Egypt. And so I feel like that's happens to us sometimes too in our lives. Like I said, that we get so comfortable in situations and jobs and relationships that we want to stay. And we don't want to do the work that it takes to leave, or we get too comfortable to leave. And so sometimes God has to make it a little uncomfortable. So we'll get from butt to feet and from feet to moving. When God makes a promise, he doesn't make it just like, oh yeah, like he's making it to some random person on the street that he's never going to see again. He's making this promise to his child. And so he desires to fulfill the promises that he makes in our lives. But we can't stay stagnant when he's trying to do that. We can't be sedentary. We can't say, oh God, I know you wanted to bless me with a relationship and a marriage. And I know that this guy is not who I'm supposed to marry, but he's who I got. And I don't want to go look for somebody else. Or Lord, I know that you've been placing it on. You promised me that I'm going to own a business and I'm going to be a boss instead of have a boss. But this position, like the economy isn't the best right now. And this position pays, and I have insurance and a 401k, and I don't really like the people anymore. And I'm, but I got a paycheck and it's constant and it's consistent. And if I, step out on my own, who knows what's going to happen? Or, if you're a part of an organization and God just wanted you to step in and be a blessing to that organization in a small amount of time so that they can grow and you can go. But you're still trying to hold on and take the reins. But that's not where he needs you to be. It's like that is important for us to just go. When God says go, we need to be willing and able to go because he has a plan for our lives and he has made promises to us, but we can't stay in the same situation, stagnant in this same filth or in this same situation when it's time for us to go. In essence, what we're doing when we stay is we're forsaking the fulfillment for being sustained, for the sustenance. And so sustenance is what it takes to sustain your life. My life can be sustained on cheese and crackers or water and crackers. But if my husband promises, oh, babe, tonight we're going to go out to a nice restaurant, to a nice dinner at your favorite restaurant. We're going to get all the things you like. We're going to get some lamb chop lollipops and everything else, some shrimp and bacon wrapped shrimp or whatever it is that I like at the time. And we're going to go and we're going to eat good. And I said, okay. And that's what he's promising me. But then I get crackers and water set in front of me. And I'm like, oh, I'm not going to be hungry, but that's not what he promised. So why would I sit here and eat these crackers and water when I know that he's promised to take me somewhere where I'm going to enjoy and really get a good meal and get enjoyment out of being sustained? Because it's one thing, like you're going to be sustained either way. That you're going to be sustained in the fulfillment, or you're going to be sustained just where you are. So why wouldn't you want to have the fulfillment of your promises to come to fruition? And sometimes, because like in this situation, the Lord will stop stop sustaining you in this position, because that's what happens in with the Israelites. He had to stop sustaining them in this situation so that he can push them towards the fulfillment. Another thing I wanted to point out in the CEV was the and. Last week I was all about the but. This week I'm all about the and. In verse 25, it says, they served the Lord and he made the Egyptians plan hateful things against them. So what that says to me, that and in that position, like when you have but in a sentence, but negates everything that's said before it for the sake of everything that comes after it. But when you have and in a sentence, and joins in everything before it to everything that's after it. So if there was a but in this sentence, it would say they served the Lord, but he made the Egyptians plan hateful things against them. So it would say it didn't matter that they served the Lord. He still made the Egyptians plan evil things against them. Instead, with this saying and, it's just saying they served the Lord and he made the Egyptians plan evil things against them. So one didn't negate the other. Despite the fact that he planned evil things against them, it didn't keep them from serving the Lord, and vice versa. So basically, the latter did not negate the former. One of the I think this happened for two reasons. Of course, I said to push them out. But one of the biggest reasons, of course, was that there was a prophecy that had to be fulfilled. And so that prophecy was back in Genesis 15. Verse 13 says, then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the country, not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for hundreds of years. So there was a prophecy that had to be fulfilled, and through the fulfillment, through God making the Egyptians' heart turn against them, that was a part of him fulfilling his prophecy. Just like he had a Joseph that he sent ahead of time to be the fulfillment of the needs that they were going to have, and the famine and things like that, to be the provision for the needs that they were going to have during the famine. He was also planning to send a Moses, but you have to get to the Moses. And so during this time, he had prophesied that they would be enslaved for 400 years and that they would be mistreated. So the fulfillment of that prophecy had to come. But to double back, when I said that I believe that this was for their benefit as well, I think that the reason it was for their benefit, because it lit a fire under them. It just kind of made them get back. It kind of started the journey of them getting back into his will. And so I think that he needed to do this to make them uncomfortable in their comfortability. Things that maybe normally would not have made you upset or would not have made you look at a certain way, at something that happened at your job. When it's time for you to go, then everything starts to annoy you. You know, your boss is mean, your coworkers don't work hard anymore, all of this stuff that probably have been the same way the whole time, but you had your rose-colored glasses on. When it's time for you to go, you're going to see everything. Or if you're in a relationship and you've been with them for a while, but God is like, this is not your husband or this is not your wife. And they've chewed the same way the whole time y'all been dating. But now all of a sudden, just the sound of them smacking annoys you. It's kind of like that push you need, like move on. He's making you uncomfortable in your comfortability so that you'll get up and get out and start the journey towards his promise. When I first read this, I've told you that these last three episodes have come out of one of my daily readings in the Bible, when I read the 105th number of Psalm, and God just kind of illuminated these three sections of verses to me. And so when he did that, I immediately got this whole push thing out of the 24th and 25th verse. And I was like, oh my goodness, he just like bombarded me with it, and I saw this push thing, and I saw that how sometimes when we're in situations that we're trying to stay in and that we're comfortable in, sometimes God has to make us uncomfortable so we'll move, because he has a fulfillment. He wants to fulfill the promises that he made over our lives. And so I saw that. However, like once I started researching for this episode, I just got so much more from it, and it was just thing after thing. And I was like, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my, I was just so excited about researching it and looking up and learning more. And so while I was researching it, I, of course, went back to real time because, like I said, like we talked about before, in the Psalms 105 was David recounting everything that God had done for the Israelites. And so I went back to when this originally took place back in Genesis. And so in Genesis chapter 47, verses 13 through 26, it talks about how there was famine all over the land and how it kept going on and on because, the famine lasted for 7 years. And so after being in famine for so long, the people ran out of money. And so when they ran out of money to pay for food, then they needed something. They were like, okay, well, we'll give you our livestock. So they gave their livestock, traded their livestock for food. And then when the livestock ran out, they gave themselves. And so they kind of entered into indentured servitude so that they could have food. Joseph would give them seed, and they would plant it, and they would give a fifth of all of that to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh during this time became even richer than he already was. And he acquired more land, more livestock, all of that on the backs of the Egyptian people because they were hungry and they needed food. And so they had to pay for the food, and that's how they paid for the food. But the interesting thing is that verses 13, that's what verses 13 through 26 tells us about. But when we go to verse 27 of the 47th number of Genesis, it says, now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Now, this is right after we hear all about everything that had happened with the Egyptians and how they were in servitude because they were starving and they needed food. But that's not what's happening to the Israelites. That's not what's happening to Joseph's descendants. Joseph's descendants are prospering. Joseph's descendants, because back in verse 11 of chapter 47 of Genesis, it says, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh had directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So they didn't have to buy food. They didn't have to use their money, sell their livestock, sell themselves or anything like that when they first got there because God had provided. When God provides, he provides. And that brings me to my favorite quote, favor ain't fair, because the Israelites definitely at this point in time had the favor of God upon their lives. And sometimes when the favor of God, well, not sometimes, all the time, that when the favor of God is upon you, it gets the attention of the people around you. Now, it can be for good or it can be for bad. Sometimes it gets the attention of people and they are drawn to God and they see how God has blessed you and they see how serving God has benefited you and they want it. They want to know God. They want to be in relationship with him. They want that same thing that you have. But however, it can go bad too. We see we see from the story of Joseph how his brothers were jealous because sometimes the favor that God is giving you can sow a seed of jealousy with the enemy. And so the Egyptians were the Egyptians were jealous. And that's why they put the Israelites into slavery, just like how Joseph's brothers was jealous and they end up selling him into slavery. When the enemy sees God prospering, growing, and doing all these wonderful things in your life, he wants to put a stop to it immediately for your benefit too, because he doesn't want you to be feeling the blessings and receiving the blessings of God. But also he doesn't want other people seeing what God is doing in your life and thinking, oh, I want some of that. I want to know this person. I want to know this Savior. I want to have access to this myself. And so sometimes he will just do whatever it takes to thwart the plans of God. But it's a good thing we know what we talked about last week, what Joseph said back in Genesis about how what they meant, how the enemy meant it for bad, but God turned it around for good. And so we see that that is definitely possible. Them coming into Egypt and having all this favor and things like that, that was amazing to me. And I mean, just seeing how God worked that out, how not only did they have favor because of Joseph's favor with Pharaoh, he was blessed, but his family was blessed, given the best parts of the land. They had food and they didn't have to pay for all of this. And so that brings me to like some lessons that I feel like we could really learn from this situation and from the Israelites during this time. Lesson number one: don't try to turn temporary circumstances into permanent situations. Like I said before, like we can do that in relationships, we can do that in jobs. And when you're in a relationship and you are head over heels for this person, but you know they're not the one for you, and you're just trying to stick around and you're trying to make it work when God has no intention of that working out. And it's like it can end up to your detriment. Even with a job, when God is telling you, okay, if your time here is done, or he didn't want you to have that job in the first place. He didn't want to bless you with that job in the first place because he wanted you to do something else, but you went left field and chose something different. So we got to just make sure that we're not trying to make temporary provisions into permanent situations. The next thing is, don't romanticize your enslavement. So with doing research for this episode, like I said, I went back and I read in Genesis and I read in Exodus just about the Israelites, and how what life was like in once they came to Egypt. And also I started reading about the Exodus out of Egypt. And so one of the things that really stood out to me when I was reading in Exodus about them leaving Egypt was in Exodus 16. Exodus 16 verses 2 and 3 says, "In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, 'If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death.'" Now, when they made this statement that I just read, it was about 2 months and 15 days after they left Egypt. And they didn't have food and they were hungry. And instead of just praying to God, dear Heavenly Father, please bless us with food, this, that, and the other, they stripped right back to, oh, well, at least, when we were in Egypt, we had pots to sit. I think that's exactly what they said. They said, when we were in Egypt, we sat around pots of food and ate all the food we wanted. Yeah, but in Egypt, you were enslaved. Yeah, but in Egypt, they were killing your children. But you were romanticizing the fact that, oh, we had all the food we wanted. Sometimes when the journey to the fulfillment of the promise is hard, we try to romanticize what we left behind. More so, not even because, oh, we think it was so great, but because right now we're going through something that's hard and we don't want to go through hard. We don't want to do hard things in life. We want it to be easy. And sometimes staying where we are is much easier than moving forward. Because at least where we are, we know what's going on. We know what's going to happen. We know. And this brings me to what I believe they were suffering from then, and what I believe a lot of us are suffering with now, and it's the fear of the unknown. I just think that a lot of times we go through life and we get stagnant and we stay in certain positions and certain circumstances that we know that God didn't intend to keep us in, because we're afraid to move forward. We're afraid of what moving forward would do. We're afraid of what it would cost, and we're afraid of it not being comfortable. And so instead of moving forward willingly, sometimes God has to get us uncomfortable. Sometimes he has to push us out, because he knows that because of that fear of what's on the other side, that we're not going to do anything. We're not going to move past where we are if we're too comfortable. Excuse me. So when the journey to the fulfillment is harder, I think that definitely even makes it gives us, it makes us feel like we have credence to believe that, oh, what I was saying was true. When I was afraid of moving forward and I stepped out on faith anyway, and now I'm struggling. See, this is why I should not have left. This is why I shouldn't have left that job. When I'm sitting here and I'm afraid, that I can't pay my mortgage, or I can't pay this bill. I should have stayed at that other job. I should not have left my job, even though God was telling you, go out, step out, and do what I asked you to do. Start that business. Go to this new city. Do whatever it is I told you to do, because it's what I told you to do. And trust me that because it's what I told you to do, that I'm going to provide for you in that situation. But I think with the fear of the unknown, it just makes us feel like, if I think the biggest thing with the fear of the unknown is because we are not in control. A lot of times when we're in situations that we're used to being in, we kind of know how things work. If we're in a relationship that is kind of toxic and it's really not beneficial for us, if we stay in, most of the time we don't stay in that relationship because it makes us happy. We stay in that relationships because we know what it takes to be sustained in that relationship. We know how to walk around on eggshells. We know the involatile, relation nature of the person we're with. We know all the red flags that are coming up because we've seen them all. But it's scary when he's like, oh no, step out. Because sometimes we fear, oh, well, if I leave this person who's not perfect, and I know I would prefer not to be with him or with her, but if I step out, what if there's nobody else there? Or what if I step out and the other person is worse than this person? Or if I have a job and you're telling me to quit my job without another job in hand, what if it takes me a long time to find another job? What if I am trying to start this business and nobody wants what I'm selling? It's like all of those things can come up, and we are so afraid of what could happen that we forget to trust the God who makes all things happen. The next thing that we can learn from the Israelites is, don't forget to remember. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 27 says, they gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. And verse 28 starts with, but. Now, what's happening in this passage of scripture is that the Israelites, after being in the desert, they finally made it to Canaan, and they sent out some spies just to go look at the land, just to spec it out and see what the people were like, what the fruit was like, what the land was like, and all that. So they sent spies out. And now, in this part of the scripture, in this part of the chapter, the spies have come back and they're giving their report. So Moses had kind of told them, oh yeah, the land's going to be flowing with milk and honey. And what the fruit is going to be wonderful, all this kind of stuff. And so they came back and they're like, yeah, you're right. You're right. That's, the land was flowing with milk and honey. This is the fruit. It's delicious. However, in verse 28, it starts with a but. And that's where I want to stake this about, don't forget to remember, because they say, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. They're afraid of the people in the land that they left Egypt to go to because God had promised it to them. They're afraid to enter this land that God had promised to them. The same God who caused the plague went on Egypt, the locusts, the frogs, the killing of the firstborn, all of that. God had done all of that. And when he got you out of Egypt, he not only got you out of Egypt, but they were like, please leave. We're going to give you gold and silver and everything you need. Just please leave. So you left there with way more than you came there with. And that God also, when you got to the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army is horseshoeing you in, he parted that Red Sea. That God, when you needed water in the desert, told Moses to hit the rock and water came gushing out. That God had a manna when you were hungry and in the desert thinking you were going to starve, called manna from heaven and quail to come so that you could eat. That God provided a cloud by day and a fire by night to guide you. Just the cloud is enough for me because where I live, you go outside on a hot day, you'll be praying for a cloud to come and cover up the sun just to give you 5 seconds of the relief so I can go from 110 to just 100. So just the cloud alone is enough to make me trust in God. But you mean to tell me you've given me all a cloud in the desert by day and fire to guide me and so I can see at night, manna and quail from heaven? And I am going to say, oh, you've given me all of that as you take me on this journey to this land you've told me to go to, that you've told me was mine, that I've been hearing about probably all my life, because I know that the promise, like I said, didn't stop when he promised it to Abraham. I know he told it to Isaac. I know he told it to Jacob. I know Jacob told it to his sons. And I know that this was something probably like a running story through their family and through their descendants. So you mean to tell me you finally get to this place that God has been promising since your great, 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 and you're gonna doubt? I think it's so easy for us sometimes to forget all that God has done for us when times get a little tough. When times get a little tough, we are more prone to say, oh, you know what? I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how this is going to work. I don't know. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to be affected by tough times, because we're human. Of course, we're going to be affected by it. We might cry, but we got to trust. We might need to vent, but we got to trust. We might need to make accommodations. We might need to do all of these things, but we have to trust, because we have to trust in the God that got us through the last thing will get us through this thing too. Right? So, how is it that the God who did all of those things, how do you give him a but? Now, we talked about earlier that when you have but in a sentence, that it negates everything before it. So, yes, the land was flowing with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. You can see how wonderful it is. But none of that matters because the people were large and the city was big and fortified. You think that's an issue for God? Or you think that's an issue for you? I think sometimes when we're sitting in a situation, it's easy for us to trust and believe in God when we can see how He's going to work things out. And I said this before, with the provision and with the promise as well, that when we can see it, oh yeah, that's easy to understand. That's easy to acknowledge. But when it doesn't make sense to us, when it just doesn't quite line up with the way that we thought it should, then somehow we think that matters. Like we have the ability to do anything about it. If God says it, I believe it, that settles it. It don't take nothing else from me but my belief and trust in him. And so that but was not warranted right there, because it doesn't matter what else he could have done, what else he's going to do for you. What he's done for you is enough for you to trust and believe him in this situation, in my opinion. But I'm like the Israelites. I am so like the Israelites. When things come up and when life gets tough, sometimes I'm like, oh Lord, like how is this gonna be? And that's why, like, I've started when I started journaling. I've been journaling for a while, and I write down and I journal more when times are bad, when we're going through a struggle, when we're going through lack, when something's going on in our life that is just hard. I journal more then. And so I was actually reading, like a couple of weeks ago, I was reading back in one of my journal entries, and I saw how I was just writing about how, God, I don't know if this is going to happen. I'm not sure if this is your will for my life, but I'm just trusting you with it, and I'm just leaving it all in your hands. And, it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. And then when I flip the page, 3 more pages, I see that it happened. It came to fruition. That thing that I had been doubting and like waffling over because I wasn't sure if that's really what God had for me. Even though I believed, like I kind of believed, but then I was like, well, it's not coming. So maybe it's not. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I got it wrong. And what I knew now, reading that retrospectively, what I knew now that I didn't know when I wrote it originally, that 3 days later, God was going to fix it. He was going to handle it. And so that gives me hope, when I'm going through something now that, what, I never know when it's going to happen. I never know when he's going to fix it. He could be fixing it right now. He could fix it in 10 minutes, 10 days, 10 years. But I just have to trust that if he said he's going to fix it, he's going to fix it. So Moses' account was true. The land was good. But they still put that but in there that negated everything before it. So we have to remember that we can't be like the Israelites. We always have to remember. So we can't forget to remember where all our blessings come from, like the song says. We can't forget to remember all that God has done for us previously while we're waiting and trusting and believing him in this season to do for us currently. And this leads me to the next one, which is don't be the reason for the delay. I was talking to my friend Keisha this week, and we try to check in weekly. Sometimes it's every 2 weeks or something like that, but we just check in with each other because she no longer lives here. So she has a wonderful podcast called Ruth Speaks. You got to go check it out. And I was just kind of telling her what I was going to be covering this week in the podcast. And so I was telling her about the Israelites and all this and where I was going. And she just was saying how sometimes we'll delay the blessings of God and getting to the fulfillment of his promises because of what we're doing or what we're not doing or where we are. Like we'll be just trying to be stagnant. And because of that, being stuck in that one place, we're delaying the fulfillment of the promise of God. And so when I was talking to her, I was trying to figure out, like, why is it? Why do we do, like, how do we delay? And we delay by being disobedient. If God is telling you, like I said before, I've used this example a lot today, but if God is telling you, okay, quit this job, this is not like it's time to move on. I want you to quit this job. But he doesn't necessarily give you another job to go to. And he's like telling you quit. And you're like, oh no, that's disobedience. If he's telling you to do something and you're not doing it, you're being disobedient. And that's one way that you can delay. My husband was working at this company, and he had gotten to the point where God had made him uncomfortable in his comfortability. Did the job pay well? Yes. At the beginning, it was a good relationship with the boss, but God wanted him to start his own business, and he wasn't doing it. And so he had gotten to the point where he was so uncomfortable that he dreaded going to work every day. And one day he finally gave in, and it was like the last straw, the straw that broke the camel's back. And he went in and quit. And that took faith in God, trust in God, belief in God, hope for the future. It took all of that because you have a wife and 2 kids at the time, and you're quitting a job with no job in sight to start a business with no working capital and all of that. Like, that's crazy. And so sometimes we're disobedient to God because we don't see it. It's like, God, how are you going to fix it? Like, if I do what you told me to do, then how are you going to make it work out? And so instead of doing like my husband did and just go, once God made him uncomfortable in his comfortability, he was like, I'm out. I'm going to follow what my Lord and Jesus said, and I'm leaving. But sometimes we stay. Sometimes we stay in that disobedience because we're afraid, like the fear of the future and or the fear of the unknown. And so we are disobedient. And so that disobedient can delay what God has to do in your life. Another way we delay is by having a lack of trust. And that kind of correlates with what I just said about how we're afraid that, the fear of the unknown, and we're afraid that, well, if I do it, how are you going to fix it? Like, how are you going to work things out? Like, we don't trust God enough to help us out, to get us out of a situation. And so we try to get us ourselves out of the situation, or we don't trust God to get us through something. So we don't want to move. That can cause a delay too, a lack of trust in God, a lack of belief in God. That all can cause us to be in a situation where the blessings and the promises of God are not being fulfilled in our lives because we don't trust God. So that causes a delay. Another way we can delay is through our stubbornness. We think we know best. We think we know how things should, could, would, and ought to be done. And so, because of all that, when we are in a situation and God is trying to tell us to go right, but we see what left holds, we're like, well, I think I should go left. And so that causes a delay because our stubbornness and our pridefulness sometimes, and our desire to be the end all be all and the one supreme ruler and controller of our destiny and lives is gearing us to being like, oh no, I know how to do this. Thank you. I've let you drive this far, but now I'm going to take the wheel and I'm going to take us this way because I know that this detour is going to take me where I want to go. And that causes a delay. So the last one, when I said don't forget to remember, and we talked about how they put the but in there because the people were big and all of that. Well, they were adamant that they were not going to go and take over the land in Canaan. And even though Caleb was all for it. Caleb was in there and he said in verse 30, then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Caleb was all in. Caleb was all in there for it, but the people were not. Once they heard the account from the other people, the other spies that they sent ahead, saying that the people were big and the city was fortified, they took that route and they were like, oh no, we can't do this. We need to elect somebody else, and went back to number one, where I said that they romanticized their enslavement. They said, we need to go elect somebody else as our leader and go back to Egypt and just like cut our losses. And they were even wanting to stone Moses and Aaron. Like, that's how serious it was. They were like, we ain't going. We not taking control of this city. We refuse. And so they came up with all this stuff. And then Moses was like, instead of being like, okay, fine, go on, do what y'all want to do, he went to God on their behalf. And he prayed to God and for their forgiveness and all this, that, and the other. And this is what came out of that. Numbers chapter 14, verse 20 says, the Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. And so, yes, they were forgiven. God forgave them for everything that they did to Moses, and for threatening to stone Moses and Aaron, and for saying that they should elect somebody else and go back to Egypt and all that. But that disobedience came at a cost. And that cost was taking what could have possibly taken them 40 days to now taking them 40 years. They delayed the blessings of God. They delayed the fulfillment of the promise of God. It's so much so that they didn't even get to experience it. Only their descendants could get to experience it. I never want to be the reason that there is a delay in the fulfillment of the promises God has placed on my life. I never want to be let my stubbornness or my disobedience or my lack of trust in God keep me from seeing what and receiving all that He has for me, whether that's material, spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, whatever. I want it all. All that God has for me, I want it. And so like I said before, when I read this verse, what I got from it, when I read these two verses originally in the 105th number of Psalms, what I got from them was about the push. Yes, the push, like God pushing us out of our comfort zone, keeping us from trying to make a temporary situation into a permanent situation. And I got all of that, yes, but I got so much more because I also got that God's favor is on his people. The way he multiplied the Israelites at the same time, the way he multiplied and blessed the Israelites at the same time that the Egyptians during the famine were um, just lacking and struggling and having to go into voluntary servitude just so that they could be sustained. And it's amazing to me how you can have those two things just juxtaposition, how you can be in the same situation as someone else, but because you have God, that your experience in that situation is so completely different. Because you can, and people will be looking at you from the outside, and it's like, she worked at the same place I work, but how does she have this? How is she buying a house? How is she having a car? How is she doing this? And it's because you have the favor of God upon you, because God takes care of his children. And so that I got that from, reading this and researching and all that as well, because the way he multiplied the Israelites and the way that during the famine that they were prospering, because they had the best, they went to a foreign country and the ruler of that foreign country gave them prime real estate in that foreign land. That's amazing to me. It also reminded me to trust the promise. Back in week 1 of covering the 100 number of Psalms, we talked about the promises of God and how they will come to fruition and how it will fulfill it. It might take him a long time, it might take him longer than we thought, but it will come to pass. And so this just honed it in and just brought it home to me to trust the promise of God, that what God promises will come to pass. And the last thing that really stood out to me, that what I really got out of this preparing for this episode this week, was just about all that went on after the Israelites actually left Egypt. After they left their comfortability and their temporary situation and went and started making the journey toward the fulfillment of the promise of God. It's just it illuminated so many things that I have dealt with in the past, and so many places that I have been myself, about the delay, about the romanticizing past experiences and past situations when I'm going through struggle. I've done all of those things in the past, and I don't know that I necessarily saw them as they were at the time that I was doing them. And so that really drove something home with me as well. So I was definitely blessed as I was preparing this episode. And so what I really want you to do this week is just examine yourself, examine your heart and your mind and your life, and see if there's anywhere in your life or anything that you're going through or anything that you're in right now that God was allowing for a temporary time just to sustain you, and you're trying to make it permanent. And if you find that there is something in your life like that, then I want you to pray God into it. I want you to ask him to reveal it to you. I want you to ask him to give you strength if need be to get out of that comfortable position. And also, if there's something that you're trying to hold on to that God wants to take away, I want you to ask him for trust. I want you to ask him to strengthen you to trust him, that he knows what's best for you, that he wants what's best for you, and that he has what's best for you, and that that's all he wants for you, because you're his child. Because we're going to be trusting and believing God for his promises over our lives. That's what I want to do. And if you feel like God has promised you something that has not come to pass yet, drop it in the comments. And we're going to pray for each other. We're going to pray that God would strengthen us. And as He gets us out of our comfort zone and as He takes us on this journey to this promise, that we'll wait patiently and that we'll believe that that His promise is going to be fulfilled, and that we'll look for His provisions on the road. And that if we need to be pushed out of our comfort zones, that we will get up as soon as those situations become uncomfortable and start to follow God out of them. I can't wait to pray for you in these different areas, and I will see you next Sunday.